like from Erdogan more than the Russians. But it's a difficult balancing act, I think, for them. So relations could go, in other words, relations look as if they're moving the right way, the political systems are moving in the same direction, the world view is coming closer and closer, the kind of authoritarian Moscow consensus is the Ankara consensus is some sort of neo-Ottoman project that Erdogan seems to be pushing. How long that lasts with the economy, that's maybe something Paul alluded to earlier. So how sustainable this project is open to question. Thank you.
So I would like also add that this is a very beautiful example of how dynamic is the present situation. We can remember, for example, the tension after the shooting down the Russian plane, the Su-24 by the Turkish F-16, and today we've got the joint or combined operation of the Turkish and the Russian troops in Syria. So we have to also raise the question of the intention of the Erdogan. I agree with this, let's say, going to the one-party authoritarian system of governing of the country. But also interesting is the position of the son of the President Erdogan. This is a question mark. If someone will visit his profile on the Facebook, we will be able to notice that his, let's say, this profile is very pro-Islamic and very friendly for the Islamic Brotherhood. This is also a question: what will be the evolution of the ideology and the system of governing in Turkey?
Yeah, thank you. Andris Spruts, Latvian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for the, I think, excellent insights, especially on Russian thinking and behavior. Namely, basically describing it as a geopolitical thinking, zero-sum game thinking in terms of zones of influence. This is the Russian side, fully subscribe to this. I think what is important for me, coming from Latvia, of course, what are responses from our region? If we speak about regional security, so how do we respond to this? In the morning, in opening session, I was a little bit surprised to hear that the country should promote geopolitical vision. I quote. Because for me, so far, I was taught that for small countries to promote geopolitical vision actually is a risky business. Usually you end up in dividing the zones of spheres of influence. But that's why my question is, so what are those sort of the fundamentals of thinking for the Central and East European countries? It's about regionalization or sub-regionalization. We see 3 Cs initiative. Is it about some kind of gravitating towards the core of Europe, about Germany? Is it about a previously rules-based order and norms and institutions? Or is it really about promoting the geopolitical vision? Would you agree with that statement, what was said in the morning by the keynote speakers? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think I missed that this morning. I got the Q&A, so I missed the promote a geopolitical vision. I think more than a geopolitical vision, promote a positive conception of a political system, so of a market democratic system and the virtues of that system. So it's almost going back to Cold War and Cold War propaganda, when the West's strength was its ability to say accountability, transparency, checks and balances. This makes for stability, this makes for adaptable systems that can survive when you have systemic shocks, survive better than brittle hard powers, as Paul said, not multidimensional, just essentially military hard power that's very brittle, that when a systemic shock comes, it can collapse. So it's it's just the logic of why it's virtuous, why it's useful to have market democratic political systems. Also, in terms of regionalization, So when it comes, for example, to discuss with Russia transponders, what Russia would want to do is to make that a Latvia-Russia discussion. And actually globalization is a better response for Latvia to say, hey, the planes crossing Latvia, the civilian airliners are going to China, so China should be in the room to discuss this issue. This isn't a Latvian-Baltic, if you like, Russian discussion. We're in a globally integrated system. From a Russian perspective, I think there's this thesis about sovereign globalization, which is really interesting, which is the notion that what Russia wants, trying to understand where Russia is and what Russia wants, is to have its economy integrated, so its commodity-based export economy, integrated enough into the global economy so that Russia can survive. But psychologically, culturally, socially, politically, isolate its own population from alien influences, as Karaganov would say, that cross. And so to do that, what you want is influence, not control, of adjacent territory. You don't want control because you can't afford to. All you can really do if you're Russia is destabilize, so you can't afford to, if you were directly controlling that territory, stabilize it. And that you don't have the resources, overstretch would become a key there. So the idea then is not territorial conquest, but influence of political and other foreign and security policies, this Finlandization notion, essentially. And sovereign globalization, I think, Russia thinks will best allow that. If you look at the 26th of March youth protests, anti-corruption protests in Russia, it kind of suggests that this is a false hope, a false paradigm, that information cannot be contained. When 17 million people are watching on YouTube, don't call him demon, or he's not demon to you. Another 17 or so million, so 35 million, all in all, through other social media, are seeing this. It just shows the authorities can't suppress and isolate Russia as you maybe could in the Cold War. In a globalized world, it's no longer possible. But so those would be my thoughts on geopolitical vision, but political system, market democratic based, is a much more, it's a much easier product to sell, if you like. It makes more sense to do that, in my view.
Okay, and again, this effort by diplomats and experts at think tanks like yours to define the combination of realism and vision is what we have to do. And perhaps this new buzzword for NATO of coherence, which they're trying to refer to their various initiatives to deal with security threats in different parts of the world, and different programs and initiatives, also kind of I think refers or would apply to all countries, including smaller ones' efforts to go about their foreign policy and vision, so that their regional relations fit in and support and complement their broader Euro-Atlantic ones, which in turn should fit in to the extent that they also have a certain global level vision or preferred outcomes. So to try to see how these things fit together rather than compete with one another, at least as a starting point for countries.
Very briefly, the following. Russia is definitely taking advantage of Western divisions, weaknesses, loss of orientation. And there is not much else to do than reverse this. Be more united, be more aware of the values, principles, and norms you are applying. I basically see this happening on a certain level of the US administration. Secretary of Defense Mattis visited the Marshall Center was it 2 weeks ago or so, and held a speech. And it's worth reading. It's on defense.gov. You can find it. How many times he referred to principles and norms and values. So while some people believe that this is the era of transactionalism, this is actually very effectively compensated by some people who are very well aware that if we say, okay, this is a geopolitical contest and you can end up here or you can end up there, then how are we going to differentiate ourselves from our main challenger, rival, whatever? So that's the first issue. Market democratic, the issue is not always some relatively marginal human rights that you are respecting. The question is indeed democracy and good governance. And when you are giving up on good governance, very soon you end up in massive corruption, as my country is heading to. I think we were the second best that went down 8 positions on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Only country that could do better than us was 3 years ago or 4 years ago, Slovenia, which went back 12 positions. Now, of course, if you think about Poland, which was 134 in 2014 and number 44 as of now, which is absolutely, no, that's Georgia, I'm sorry. But Poland also made about 30 or 40 points. So some countries can really break out and indicate that you can do a lot with good governance. Poland, I think, was 67th about 7-8 years ago, and now is way above many in East Central Europe, which is indication. And this, of course, will result in economic well-being, in behavior of investors, and so on and so forth. You can drag it out, but you are not going to be able to say goodbye to good governance. If you don't have good governance, sooner or later you are not going to have the rest either. The next one is Russia has 2 inconsistencies. One of them, Russia is a country which is very much a sovereignty-based, Westphalian system-based country. At the same time, the Russian Federation denies full-fledged sovereignty of a good number of other countries, which is basically the Russian conception: only great powers are sovereign, the rest don't matter. I don't want to refer to the lovely saying of a Russian leader who said about Poland that Poland is a cloned state, and if we want to speak to Warsaw, we speak to Washington. That happened about a decade ago. The person is well known who said it, and so on and so forth. So this kind of behavior is totally inconsistent. The other inconsistency, that Russia wants to maximize its sovereignty while reaping economic benefits from globalization. The two things will not go hand in hand for a long time. The last one is, and it's already a bridge to the next panel where I will be able to speak about Russian-German relations. While we speak about unity in Europe, and while we have some doubts occasionally about how much the United States is going to be with us on every day, we have to notice a move of the power center. Whether you are going to be happy or not, I can't help you with that. But the power center is very significantly moving from Brussels to Berlin. So we will have to cope with the fact that a united Europe, or a united, extended Western Europe, will be very much under German leadership, and we will be just as excited about German elections, not now, when they are not going to be particularly exciting on September 24, I hope. President Erdogan could contribute, sending a few million migrants. But if we don't take that, but at the next elections, we will be just as excited about German federal elections as we were excited on November 8 last year.
Thanks. Laura Gheorghiu, University of Graz. 2 questions for Professor Hubert. First of all, when you mentioned the strong points and the weak points of Russia, you put on that list the idea of neo-modernism. Can you explain it a little bit? Because my question is whether this neo-modernism has strong connections to Orban's idea of illiberal democracy. That's first question. And second question is perhaps more theoretical. You didn't mention anything about Euro-Asianism, about this narrative. Is it slowing down, as I feel it, or it really lost any chance to influence the security story? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And others, of course, can answer that question as well. So neo-modernism, this is, I came across a reference, RIAC, the Foreign Ministry think tank, under Andrei Kortunov a couple of months ago, discussed this idea that Dugin is putting forward, and other nationalists, ultra-nationalists in Russia. And it's the idea that essentially we are postmodern in Europe, and we're failed and dysfunctional, and we're destabilizing, and we're decadent, and we're on the wrong side of history. But Russia returning to the past, eternal, great, glorious, Russian past with Russian historical exceptionalism and messianism at the heart of it, is neo-modernist. So neo-modernist is essentially nationalism, transactionalism, holism, and historicism. It sounds very much like the Russian education minister who talked of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. What it essentially does, I think it's a kind of alibi for deferred modernization. So we're not going to modernize, we're not going to do structural economic reform, we're not going to liberalize, we're a besieged fortress, and so we go back to the past. And Kortunov ended his discussion of neo-modernism by saying, quote unquote, can we really march into the future with our eyes on the past? You know, the past is glorious, the future is going to be glorious, and the present is empty. There's nothing happening in the present, so we don't talk about the present, we just focus in on the past. It indicates path dependency, patrimonial pattern of governance is still there, I think, in Russia, and that the status quo is stability and order, and any reform or any change is inherently destabilizing, and therefore we shouldn't do it. But I think it's an excuse or an alibi for an elite that realizes that they run Russia and they own Russia, and if you change the structure of the economy, they're going to lose power. And they don't want that. And so they're willing to put their own cynical interests above that of the longer-term sustainability of the state, which is a shame. But that's essentially neo-modernism, I think. It's interesting to see if it takes off as an idea in Russia, because the so-called Moscow consensus, something David Lewis has written about, if you look last year, I think, in, I forget the paper, but David Lewis and Moscow consensus, he looks at 4 or 5 governing characteristics of the Russian political system and how that also translates into a strategic posture that Russia wants others to adopt. And it's kind of linked with neo-modernism. So it's kind of philosophical background. And I think it may, when Lavrov starts to talk about it, then that's a kind of indicator that it's an idea whose time has come. Thank you.
Maybe very briefly, I always agree with Graeme. That's the starting point. The Russian Federation had a great opportunity when it had its drawers full of money to modernize everything. They missed this opportunity. They did not diversify the economy, except that they are going to have significantly more defense export. That's something that is high value added export, at least, it's not grain and diamond and oil and uranium. So there is something. They missed the opportunity fundamentally. Now the drawer is empty. They are not generating the revenue which is sufficient to have this exquisite lifestyle of people in Moscow. Russia is not Moscow. And 95% of Russian television time is Moscow, eventually St. Petersburg, a little bit of Sochi. So the places which do develop. But take a look to other parts where people are making teachers 7,000 rubles income, which means €100 a month. And of course the prices are lower. The price average 100, Moscow is 144. So Moscow has about a 1.5 times more expensive local economy. But still living on €100 is impossible. And you see the infrastructure, you see the buildings, you see a lot of things where money could go. But the money doesn't go there. Money did not go into diversification. And the last year, in January 2016, when German Gref, there are 2 macroeconomists who are worth listening, Gref, who is the CEO of Sberbank, and Kudrin, who was the longest-standing finance minister. Gref said at the Gaidar Forum, we must honestly admit that we have lost to our competitors the era of oil was over, and that in the new technology-driven world, the difference between the leaders and the losers would be larger than during the Industrial Revolution. These are pretty tough words. You don't find the full speech anywhere on the internet. 3 days after it was delivered, it disappeared from Gref's website, from the Gaidar Forum's website, from everywhere. Now take a look. A year and a half passed, and last week, on the 5th of July, not even the English translation is available on the President's website, there was a meeting of Zasedanie Sowieta po strategicznym rozwiciu I priorytetnym projektom, meeting of the Council on Strategic Development and Priority Projects. Kudrin and Gref sitting over there. The President held a relatively shallow introductory speech. And at the very end, after a long discussion, he said, "Those who are late in the competition in all cases quickly find themselves in full dependence of the leaders of the process of technological innovation." So it took a year and a half to understand that Gref is not the enemy of the nation. The only reaction to Gref's speech was very interesting. The vice president of the Duma from the Liberal Democratic Party, Zhirinovsky, said that Gref should resign from all his posts because he's disloyal to the Russian state. So not much is happening in Russia which would make Russia sustainable economically in the long run. Graeme is absolutely right. The current leadership is worried about starting any kind of change. There are so many unseen things happening in Russia. The lorry drivers blockading highways, local strikes, the entire Khrushchevka issue. The Khrushchev built 5-story buildings that they want to demolish in the middle of Moscow. And the problem is not that they want to demolish, if they want to give better housing to people. The problem is that it indicates the total distrust of the Russian people in their government, because they immediately believed, okay, so we are going to be moved out to the outskirts of Moscow.